There was a couple look on your face.
Yeah. I was like, oh, okay, I'm not stuck.
Sorry. Gotta go. That made my day. Oh, I don't want to ask you something.
Yeah, that's okay.
That works too, Charles?
Hey, you got your space again.
Oh, how did that happen?
All right, welcome back. Welcome back, welcome back. I am grateful for those of you who came here this weekend. I'm also grateful for those of you who are online watching and in the common thread bickering back and forth. You were mocking them for pretending to be present. It's okay. So we have class tonight, and due to a fluke of the schedule and various holidays, both Jewish and constitutional, we have no class this week. I know you're devastated. There, that just clicked, right? The chosen people, the chosen document works. So for next week, you're not going to see me. We will come back refreshed, rejuvenated the following week. Any questions before we get started? Yes, ma'am. I am not in the building next week at all. If you want to, sorry? If you want to meet by phone, we can do that. I'd be happy to find some time. It's going to be a little tight, but I'll be happy to make time for all of you. Don't worry. But I will not be here. Yes, ma'am. Well, thank you for asking. It is a federal holiday. Not that. So there's actually a debate about this. A number of years ago, Congress passed a law saying that any federal institution that receives federal money is required to host an event on September 17th, Constitution Day, to commemorate it. Now, I think that statute's unconstitutional because it's compelled speech. Right? I willingly celebrate Constitution Day, and in fact, we'll have a celebration here on Monday, if you can come during the day. Judge Elrod from the Fifth Circuit will be our guest speaker, but I don't think Congress can compel you to. So every year, the Cato Institute, who hosts your lovely constitutions, has their Constitution Day, where they go over the previous term of the Supreme Court, and I'm speaking there. It's on Hawaii versus Trump. I wrote an article on it, so every year at Constitution Day, I'm usually there. It's almost like a secular holiday for me, far more so than most holidays we actually celebrate. But it's a good holiday. September 17th was the day that the Constitution was finalized in Philadelphia, 1787, summer, and then went on to be ratified about 2 years later. But anyway, so it's my holiday. I have 2 holidays 1 week. It's a lovely week. Anyone else? Don't ask me about Labor Day. I worked through Labor Day. Don't even stop for a minute. But Constitution Day, that's a holiday. It's true. It's true. Very important holiday.
So you're going to be celebrating it in Philadelphia?
I'll be in D.C. I've done Philadelphia for Constitution Day, but I'm usually in D.C. on Constitution Day. Okay. Hopefully I don't get stuck there. I think I'll be okay. I think the storms will pass by both Houston and pass by D.C., but our friends in North Carolina be dry and safe. Okay, anything else in your minds? Okay. Today we are starting a new topic. We spent the last, 3 or 4 weeks on Congress. What are the legislative powers? What can Congress enact? What can Congress not enact? Commerce Clause, Necessary and Proper Clause, taxing power, spending power. All that, thankfully for you, is now in the past. But we are moving on. Congress powers are enumerated in Article 1 of the Constitution. Today we're moving on to the executive, whose powers are enumerated in Article 2 of the Constitution, which leads us to the poll question that I want to start off with today. It's a true-false question. The question for you is this. The president only has enumerated powers. The president only has enumerated powers. True or false? Okay, another 10 seconds. You know, the worst thing is when you have the dry cleaners, you get to the Constitution in your pocket. I always have a spare, don't worry. You, do not worry. I always carry an emergency one. It's a problem. I moved recently to a new house, and my Constitutions are not in the same place as my suit jacket. So I usually keep all my Constitutions in my closet with my suits, and I could just take one out, but everything's all disheveled. What?
Every day.
Every day. Whenever I bring my suit to the cleaners and leave one, they always get, "Oh, we saved your Constitution." I thank you. Who's next? Wow, that was quick. Thank you.
I'm going to redeem myself because I couldn't define liberty, so.
I can't define liberty. I've been doing this for forever. I don't know what it means.
I will never forget that.
You will never forget that. Okay, well. By the way, tell us what book you bought for your daughter.
Oh, my RBG book?
Yeah. So I want a book report, though, okay? From your daughter.
I'll ask her.
And she come to class and talked about it, okay?
I don't think you want that. She's sassy.
I can't handle it?
You might not be able to. She is sassy.
I think that's a challenge. I've had some, okay, whatever.
After everybody else, though.
Well, maybe up to you. What do you think here, Jesse?
I'm
What's
going with false.
okay? Why do you think false?
Mainly because of the oh, see, I said I was gonna do myself. I want to call it
Take care clause.
take care. Thank
Okay,
you.
tell me why.
Because it's kind of like the necessary and proper clause.
Wait. Is it necessary and proper an unenumerated power? Ah.
I still think that. I mean.
So, no, Jesse. I think you're on the right track, right? The take care clause, right? The president has the duty to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, right? Marcus?
No, it just mentions he has power, maybe says those powers are.
Oh, wait a minute. Glynis, what do you think? All right, so I want you to take a look at, I don't have your page numbers, I'm in a different book. So Article 1, right, very first page of the Constitution. Recall, it says, all legislative power herein granted shall be vested in Congress. And what did we say? Congress has only those powers that are granted by Article 1 of the Constitution. Right? So far, so good. But it's a little bit phrasing here, right? So it's a little bit different. Compare Article 1, Section 1 and Article 2, Section 1. Article 2, Section 1 says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. It doesn't say the executive powers herein granted. It does not say that. It just says the executive power. Again, not powers, singular. Executive power shall be vested in the president. And just look at the text, right? Forget everything else. Frame the same. Beyond that, we'll probably disagree. But the text is a little bit different. It's understanding that the executive power for some body of authority, right? Whatever that is, it's something, the executive power. Some of these executive powers, the Constitution. Article Section 2. The President is Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy. Jesse mentioned this a minute ago. The President shall take care of the laws faithfully executed. He can issue pardons, for example. The President can negotiate treaties. The President can nominate various executive and judicial branch officials. The president can remove various executive officials. He can't fire the judges, but can at least remove people in his own branch. Right? So the Constitution lists a lot of things the president can do. But it doesn't list everything. I think Marcus alluded to this a minute ago. There are certain things, and throughout the history of our republic, there have been various times where presidents have done stuff where there wasn't a clear power to do so, and sometimes they got away with it, and sometimes they didn't. So the back up to and the powers, and I think authoritative statement of trying to figure out are not the president's powers. Right? There's no clause in the Constitution that says the president can seize property. There isn't. It doesn't exist. It says the government can seize property, but it doesn't say the president can. It also doesn't say the president can't seize property. Right? The Takings Clause doesn't really say which branch of government takes property. Right? The Takings Clause, the Fifth Amendment, merely says no private property can be taken for public use without just compensation. Doesn't say that only Congress can do it. It actually is silent on the question. And then we have Maryland, President Lincoln. It's the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended. Doesn't say who can suspend it. Doesn't say Congress or the president. Now we can make structural arguments, right? The suspension clause appears in Article 1. That lists all Congress's powers, therefore it's Congress. But again, the text doesn't give a 100% answer. The Fifth Amendment Takings Clause doesn't say anything about Congress. Maybe the president can seize property. Who can pay for it? Can the president write a check? This is Justice Douglas. So we often have these questions about what are the scope of Congress, and those are fairly easy. It's Article 1 going right down. Broader powers to do stuff, and it's not clear if they can do it. Because we don't have a clear enumeration of presidential powers, one of the most important factors the courts have considered is past practice. That is, if presidents have done something for a long time, one after the other, and no one questions it, that's a pretty good indication the president has that power. Justice Scalia once described this as the adverse possession approach to the Constitution. You haven't looked through, right? If you keep doing something over and over again, then you've actually acquired that authority. So what you're finding in this topic, powers, becomes a little frustrating, right? I can't give you a clause in the Constitution saying what clause, right? I can't do that for you in this topic. It's a much more nebulous authority. And indeed, a lot of the authority stems from what's called the vesting clause. Article 2, Section 1. It's called the vesting clause. And it simply says that the executive powers will be vested in the President of the United States. All right. Now, you know, Senate. And then each house has a lot of people, right? The Senate has 100 members. Right? House has 435 members. 535 members want that, but I can't do that, right? Now, the president perhaps will say, you write the pardons, I'll sign them, maybe a different story, but he can't give the power away. Now, Markia, let me ask you a question. Why do we have a single unit? It is a question, yeah. Why do we have one executive? And just to give you a sense, at the time of the founding, many states were headed by tribal council of 3 governors. States had set up. In fact, single question, why? Good place to start.
And it makes sense. I guess he talks about the fact that the responsibility or the responsibility is on the president, and you can hold him accountable.
Well, why couldn't you hold accountable, Markia, a 3-member commission, 3 governors, whatever, 3 presidents working together?
I guess it would be hard to pin down who would be responsible for things.
Yeah. So let me give you guys an easy example, right? You have 3 friends, you and 2 other people. You want to decide what movie to go see. You want to decide what restaurant to go to. What usually happens? Yeah. Well, a couple of things can happen, I suppose. Maybe one person predominates, says, we're going to this movie, too bad, right? Or you sit there and you argue for an hour about what movie to go see, right? Or one person picks the restaurant and it's really bad, and then you blame that other person, right? Even though all of you effectively made the decision, right? Or back in the day when those Blockbuster had to go there pick out a movie, it was a lot of work, right? By the way, there's one Blockbuster left in the United States. There's one left. It's in Oregon somewhere. There's only one left. Yeah. No. No. The again. Whatever. That's okay. Anyway, you're next, so you're so Jeremy, right? Yeah, their program called me once, but I didn't get in. I did talk to one of the producers once. Whatever. Probably set me up anyway. I'm always careful when I get those calls. Always gotta be careful. So Jeremy, what is the upshot that single executive versus 3 in terms of accountability?
If you have 3 executives, if there's any kind of, you want to, there's no real way to be able to say this executive made this responsible. There's always the thing point fingers at each other, and there's ways to shift blame. And it's not transparent.
Very good. Thank you. I sometimes try to follow and it doesn't. That you need a criticize the idea of a feeble executive. You need energy. You need unity. You need duration. You need support. You need competency, right? Besides these ingredients, essential elements of any effective administration. He criticizes the states that have executive councils, like 3 governors, for example, because you can always shift the blame. Oh, it wasn't me, it was Bob, it was Sally, right? You can always shift the blame to someone else. With a single president, you know who's in charge. And if something goes wrong, it's that person's fault. But with great power comes great responsibility, right? To give all that power to a single person, it's unique in our constitutional order. And if you think about it, the Constitution gives the president powers that no one else has, and he can do things that no one else can do. which is why the process to the framers, because you're putting a lot of power in the hands of one person. But act on yes. There's a few things the president can do unilaterally. Weak executive, if a weak executive can't accomplish anything, the executive and the country as a whole is destined to fail. Yes, ma'am. Let me address Adrian's question. Right? She says, so let me address the question. The president's authority being subject to the executive, the Congress, right? Where the president can't Congress passed a bill. How he executes, and that's the key point, right? Once Congress passes some bill telling the president we will fund your military of so and so dollars, he gets to decide the strategy of how to execute the war, right? The president doesn't need to go to Congress and say, do we bomb this? Do we send this missile there, right? They give the president a lot of leeway, and the president can then decide. Now you can imagine every time the president wants to bomb this country or that country, has to go to Congress. It will be very, very problematic, right? Once you get the declaration of war, it activates his powers, for example. There's this great story. It was in the early years of the Republic where President Washington went to Congress. This was still was in Philadelphia. And he had to negotiate a treaty, I think, with one of the Indian nations. And he brought his Secretary of State or someone. Okay. This and that. Washington. Just negotiate and vote. We need to deal with this. And they said, well, we'll form a committee to study it. And Washington gets so angry. It's like, what are you guys doing? Apparently he left. He just did not, he just voted to do my vote, let me deal with it. Adrian's question is a good one, right? We do have checks and balances, but once the delegation's made, the president is allowed. So the two cases today, at first glance, have absolutely nothing in common, right? I remember I had this conversation with Randy. Why on earth do you put Merriman next to Youngstown? But there's a common thread. There's a common thread, right? The common thread is this. What happens when the president tries to exercise an authority that traditionally belongs to the Congress? And Congress didn't authorize that action. I think everyone agrees that Congress could suspend the writ of habeas corpus, and if he did it, okay, that, it sucks, but they can do it. And Congress also seized private property. It sucks, but they can do it, right? They want to take over a steel mill, they could do it. They can do it. But in both of these cases, Merriman and Youngstown, Congress didn't authorize it, or at least right away. And the president was responding to an circumstance, Civil War, or Korean War, whatever it happened to be, and just did it. And somehow the case made its way to the courts. And in both cases, they found that the president acted unlawfully. And in only the second case, it actually mattered. The first case didn't really make much of a difference. So let's talk about who's next. Sergio.
Just a quick question.
Please.
Just had a question.
It's funny. Isn't that a good question?
I was confused.
Okay, one at a time. Man, I heard her voice. So, does anyone know the answer? I think yeah, Marquia? Yeah. On earth was this opinion issued from the Circuit Court of Maryland? We don't have a good answer, actually. The short answer is the Supreme Court is also responsible for a geographic region, right? So today, the Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, has supervisory authority over Maryland, D.C., Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, right? The Fourth Circuit and the D.C. Circuit. So if there are any emergency appeals that come up, he's responsible for them. For a long time, Justice Scalia was our circuit justice. Alito, maybe it was Gorsuch. I can't remember. I think it's either Alito or Gorsuch with the Fifth Circuit right now. I can't recall who they added to it. Tawney had responsibility over the Circuit Court of Maryland. But this case arose in a very strange fashion. We'll do the facts in a minute, but after Merriman was arrested, Merriman's lawyers went to Tawney's house in Baltimore and basically knocked on his door. And they gave him some papers to hear filing a lawsuit. This was not filed in any sort of conventional way. There's a reading reference by Professor Seth Barrett, who's a very good friend of mine. He's written in the case that Tawney might not have jurisdiction over this. I think it might be right. It's unclear exactly how he had jurisdiction. But what is clear is this was not resolved by the Supreme Court. No one else in the Supreme Court had anything to do with this. This was only by Tawney. And as a result, it's of only limited effect, because there's only a circuit court opinion, a lower court opinion. The entire manner in which Tawney ruled is unorthodox. Tell me why, Kenesha. Oh, I know. I don't have to think. I go Sep. So we've been talking about Dred Scott also, so I think we got some there. This was, yeah. So I think Tawney had a very strong grievance against Lincoln. A very strong grievance against Lincoln. And he was intent on finding some way to issue a ruling against Lincoln, even though he knew very well that his decision would have zero impact on how the war was being prosecuted. But Sergio's question is good. We don't know why he did it this way. This wasn't a Supreme Court decision. He did have responsibility for the Maryland court, but this is not normal. It was not a conventional way. Okay, Kenesha, good?
Yeah, he's dead now, so.
Well, he's dead, and it's actually he's not just dead. He's dead and almost gone. So I always mention this point. What? He's been dead a very long time. So actually, Tawney, and I'll mention this now. We'll come to this later in the semester. Tawney is most well known for his decision in the Dred Scott case. Now, if I ask you who wrote Plessy versus Ferguson, you have no idea. Henry Billings Brown, right? Very good. What? Damn. Attention. But if I just ask the average person, right, who wrote Plessy, right? Who wrote Prig, Joseph Story, right? You don't know, but for reasons that history can only tell us, the name Roger Tawney has become synonymous with slavery. It's just people know it in common usage that you wouldn't have with other cases. So in recent years, there's been a very rigorous and robust debate about removing statues and monuments and different displays concerning the Confederacy. Now, Maryland, you may not think of it, but it was a southern state. It was a slave state and a very much pro-slave state that stayed in the Union. And Tawney was a native of Baltimore, and there are statues, or I should say were statues of him throughout the state. And some years ago, there was actually a lot of vandals, and they pour red paint or whatever on the statue. And the county actually voted to take down a Tawney statue. In fact, I think the state capitol in Annapolis, they had a statue of Tawney which they took down in the middle of the night. Like they did like pitch black, 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. They just took it right down. Now, one food for thought for you: the Supreme Court has a chamber. And was it the Supreme Court? Anyway, in the atrium of the Supreme Court, they have busts of each of the chief justices lined one after the other, and Tawney's still there. And I expect at some point there'll be a petition to get the Supreme Court to perhaps remove the bust of Justice Tawney, but maybe that'll happen in the future. But it's still there as of now. Okay. So who am I up to? James, let's do the facts in Merriman, please. Very, very weird case, very unorthodox case. It's unlike any case I think you'll ever read in any law school case book. It just doesn't fit the normal rule. Do you want to give me the facts, James, please?
So Merriman,
He was a Confederate. I mean, yeah. I mean, he's some. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, one thing just to think about. I'll come back to James, I promise. But it's called the Civil War, but there was never a declared war against the South. There was never a declared war. If you ask Lincoln in the Union General, I would say that it was an insurrection, that there was a rebellion, right? The rebels. And effectively, they were viewed as traitors, right? The Southerners who were basically rebelling against their own government, and they were viewed as insurrectionists and traitors. And, oh, damn, I put it away. And if you actually look at the 14th Amendment, let's just pull this out. You go to Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. No, I'm sorry, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. It says, no person shall be a senator or representative, blah, 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 blah. If he shall engage in insurrection or rebellion against the United States or given aid and comfort to the enemies. So just take a look at that. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, right in there. Took insurrection or rebellion against the United States or give aid and comfort to the enemy. Basically, you were a member of the Confederacy. You were disqualified from holding office, from holding any federal office, unless Congress removes your disability. And that happened a number of times. But it was true that people who were indeed insurrectionists and rebels, and that they were going to be denied any sort of position in the new government. And this is a big thing during Reconstruction, that you basically couldn't have Southern governments because they were all basically traitors, right? The Union basically ran the South for a number of years until enough people were able to get back to the government. James, go on.
Conflict or whatever.
The War of Northern, the conflict between the states, or however you want to call it.
So General Cole.
Cadwalader.
uh,
Union General Cadwalader. Yep.
held Merriman. And he said earlier they went to Tony's house, knocked on the door, saying that we need him to be released to court, not released from captivity, but to be held for trial. And the general said no. He sent a colonel with a letter stated here, 525, stating that the president had allowed them to halt or suspend writ of habeas corpus for the time.
Okay. What is this writ of habeas corpus? What does this mean?
It means that everyone has the right to, the Latin is produce the body, but the right to go to trial, not held without trial.
Well, do you have to have a full-blown trial?
Or,
What do you get under habeas corpus? What's like the most important thing you get? No, do you want to, all of you, James, just one at a time.
due process,
What does that mean?
meaning that not held without being seen or.
Yeah, okay, that's keyword seen, right? The core element judge, right? That the jailer, the commander of the fort, brings the body to the court. And this does a few things. One, I'll make sure the guy's still alive, right? I mean, I know this sounds obvious, but you can say, yeah, we're locking him up for that stuff, right? So you bring the body before the judge. And at that point, the jailer says, I am holding Josh for such and such reasons, right? And the judge can make a critical decision. Is this legitimate? Right? We have this in our criminal system today, right? You can be arrested by the cops, and you're required to be brought before a magistrate within 24 hours, 48 hours, whatever the law requires, right? That every prisoner must be brought before some neutral magistrate within a certain number of hours to say, is this person being held lawfully? At that point, they can have a bail hearing and say, no, you can let them out during trial, or you have to be remanded. But this is the basis of habeas corpus, right? You have to deliver them for the magistrate, the judge. Now, during the Civil War, Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus, and he did this unilaterally, right? It wasn't Congress who did it. It was President Lincoln who did it. And as a result of President Lincoln suspending habeas corpus, his generals, right, those who he supervised, were then able to detain people at Fort McHenry in Baltimore. Anyone ever been to Fort McHenry in Baltimore? It's this huge fort right by the Baltimore Tunnel Harbor. Beautiful place. And they detained a Merriman without any sort of process. Okay, so let's go through the chronology, right? Justin. Tawney sends an order to the fort, and he says, bring Merriman's body to me. Okay, what happens next?
They refused to let it go.
Well, let's go. This.
This is after.
Yeah, Tawney issued an order to the fort saying, bring forth Merriman's body. What happens next? No, one at a time. What do you think? Well, tell me about the letter. Tell me about the letter.
The letter said that.
Who had the letter get to the court?
I'm not sure who he sent.
Did the general personally deliver the letter to Judge Tawney?
No, I don't believe he did.
How did it get there? This is actually important. Andrew?
He sent it with his colonel.
Very good. Andrew, the order said, you, general, show up with the body. The general said, no, and I'll send my associate, the colonel, with a letter saying that he's charged with acts of treason. And then the letter said that he's authorizing the president to suspend the writ for public safety. He requests that you postpone the action. So, Andrew, generally, if a judge says, you come here with a body and you send your associate with a letter saying, screw off, what does a judge do in such a situation?
He sends a guy with a gun to go.
What do you call that? What's the court's power to do something like that called? There's a C word.
Contempt.
Very good. Tawney holds the general contempt. Now, what is contempt? It's the inherent power of the court to enforce its judgments. So usually, if a court orders you to jump, you say how high, right? Why? Because the court can order you in contempt. That could be a monetary fine. They can force you to pay a penalty, or they can incarcerate you. They can issue a warrant for your arrest and drag you down to the jail and hold you in contempt until you deliver the body, right? I hope none of you ever are held in contempt unless you want to be. There are times, and I take this with a grain of salt, where a judge can be able to happen, and you want to make a point of your client's defense. It might be worth it spending a night in jail to make a point. I don't say it lightly, but just it happens. And if your judge is acting like a jerk, you can make a big fuss about it, right? I spent the night in jail for my client. You know, whoa, huh? Go figure. He'll come back. Anyway, that was a okay. Everything's fine. Yay, back. He looks like Severus Snape, doesn't he? From Harry Potter? Right? 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 Snape? Anyway, definitely Slytherin, right? Definitely. Anyway. So Tawney then holds the general contempt. And I think Andrew said it correctly. Can you imagine? Tawney tells his court deputy, court marshal, you go to Fort McHenry, right? This Union military base, and you say, knock, knock, who's there? I want to arrest the general, right? Not gonna fly. Not gonna work, right? I mean, this is a point where it becomes obvious that the court's contempt power is worthless, right? I think I asked you this the first week of class. Why do people listen to courts? And this is one of those cases I had in mind, right? You got a federal judge, Supreme Court, Chief Justice saying, come to court so I can arrest you. And they say, yeah, that's nice, bye-bye. The court was impotent, right? He had nothing. There's nothing he can do. Yeah. Then he said, okay, assemble a posse, take down the Union fort. At that point, it's basically the Confederacy, right? Taking down a Union army, right? It's remarkable to think about that for a minute, but it doesn't work. What does Tawney do? He's right. Right? They are unable to enforce the judgments of the people. They can write an opinion, have it delivered to the White House, and that's it. They can't do anything. They have neither the power of the sword nor the power of the purse. Federal 78. Right? They can't do a damn thing. Hamilton said that the least dangerous branch. He should be right. This is a case where the general said, I'm not going to call. Now, probably Lincoln ignored Tawney. And I used to teach this, and I feel guilty that I used to say this. I was dead wrong. I'll admit it freely. Seth persuaded me beyond any doubt. Lincoln was not bound to the judgment, right? The judgment concerned General Calder, who was the jailer of Merryman. So Lincoln had no ignore. But Lincoln was aware that he had to spend this writ, and Congress hadn't allowed him. All right, so any questions on the facts? Very, very important fact in the story. All right, so Hari, you want to walk me through the analysis of why Tawney thinks that suspending the writ in this case was unconstitutional? Very good.
Provides that the privilege of the writ of habeas
does the text say, Sahar, which branch of government gets exercises power? Okay, so then what's the... The suspension clause is in Article 1. For the president, whose power is in Article 2. We saw a small it doesn't have any powers. Now, the court rejected that argument, which I think was a sound argument, but they rejected it. Here, it's the flip side. It's an article. Is correct. It might be a jerk, but I think he's actually right on this question. Can you show that okay? You think he's right on this one, at least on this question?
I kind of ignored him.
Okay, well, I think he's right in this question at least, okay? So he says, argument, right? He says that there's no history in, at that point, about 100 years of America, of the president suspending the writ by himself. Even though President Jefferson may have considered doing so during the Aaron Burr conspiracy, the president did not. Then he says, does it make a difference, Austin, that we're in a state of emergency? In other words, do the president's powers expand during times of crisis? Weird connection. Why does... Here, we times of crisis. How do we know when that crisis finishes? Right? Right? A disaster is a terrible thing to waste, right? They tend to last forever. And it's very often the case that if you surrender some power to the executive during time of a crisis, the power does not return to the other branch. All right. So everyone get the general legal argument. The legal arguments aren't complicated in this case. Fairly straightforward. Now, Brooke, let me ask this question. The clerk, the Senate do this. I mean, it's very, again, it's strange. You've not seen something like this before, right? Right? Usually when the judges make the ruling, it's like, okay, we made a ruling, let's go home. Why does a judge here send the opinion to the White House? What on earth, what was Tony doing here?
Well, he said that he wanted it to remain with the high officer in fulfillment of his constitutional obligation to execute.
Oh, so what do you think he was trying to tell the president, Brooke?
Yeah, he was trying to tell him that he didn't have the authority to do this.
Okay. So he's basically giving the president a lecture, right? The same way that Jessie will tell her daughter, that's bad, you can't do that. And what happens when you tell your daughter that? What does she say?
She'll do it anyways.
And that's what Lincoln did, right? See? Yeah, basically, yeah. Who's more of a Spitfire, Lincoln or your kid? There you go. So you see, I think Brooke's correct. Tawney knew damn well that Lincoln was not going to change his war strategy because of a stupid little opinion from a judge in Maryland, right? It wasn't going to happen. But he wanted to create some sort of guilt, right? Some sort of record that he was willing to stand up to Lincoln. And, you know, he had this opinion sent to Lincoln. There's no evidence Lincoln ever was aware of it. He probably found out. He didn't like Tawney very much. Lincoln rose to prominence on criticizing the Dred Scott decision, right? We'll talk about this later, but that's how he made his career, right? He was just an Illinois lawyer who rose to prominence arguing against the Dred Scott case. So he didn't have any, good relations with Taney. I don't think he gave every thought very much. But a situation where he made a decision that he was acting unconstitutionally, the judge did not bind him, and Lincoln kept doing what he was going to do. And in fact, subsequent to this, Congress actually ratified the suspension. Congress said that we approve of the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus retroactively. What does that mean? We sanctioned the suspension as if we had done it initially, right? So from the day Lincoln suspended the writ, Congress says we approve of this. Does that make it okay? I don't know. It's one of those study guide questions I don't have an answer to. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But at least Congress seemed to recognize that Taney was right. Because if Taney was wrong, Congress would not have to do anything. Right? The fact that Congress felt compelled to pass a suspension bill means that it was Congress's job and not the president's. So really the entire effect of decision by Taney was fairly short-lived, because eventually Congress then approved the suspension. What about Merriman? Well, he was held for a bit, eventually let go, and he was never tried. They dismissed the charges against him after the war was over. So all this was largely for naught. He was held for some brief period, and that was it. All right, so questions on Merriman? Yes, Maya? How do we know that? Whose word are we taking? Was there any evidence presented?
Sure.
No, that's an important point, right? The general is saying he was a traitor, right? Did he give any evidence? See, have a neutral judge. The judge says, okay, you call him a traitor, what's your evidence? When you have a general, there's no requirement to give evidence. And that's an important point of habeas corpus. The government can hold him for holding bogus charges, right? BS charges. So yeah, he's a rebel. Now, he actually was, right? I think he actually was aiding the South. To what extent we can argue, but he was a Southern sympathizer. We'll just put that as a charitable thing. Yeah, Mia? Or was that Noel? I saw a hand somewhere here. Yeah.
So, retroactively authorizing the suspension,
Yeah.
does that run into any issues with no bill of attainder?
Very good question. So ex post facto prohibits Congress from passing a law saying what yesterday now becomes illegal. So I don't think this is an ex post facto violation, but I think it's a very tough question about whether retroactively suspending the writ is permissible. Right? It says shall not be suspended unless in cases of rebellion and when the public safety may require it. That's forward-looking, right? When there's rebellion, when the public safety requires it, you can suspend it. It's an open question if you can suspend it retroactively. And even, one second, Marcus, and even if you could, would you have to let him go then arrest him again? Does that make much sense? I mean, just think about it for a minute, right? Okay, fine. Congress enacted this, let him go and arrest him immediately, and then you're fine. And if that's the answer, does it really matter? Right? If you can arrest the guy right away, does it even matter? Yeah. This is basically in times of insurrection and rebellion where the legal process can operate.
Isn't a bill of attainder like Congress saying that
Frankfurter, right? We'll get to that, yeah.
So given our current climate where you hear constantly unprecedented, it's just totally unprecedented, never seen before. Could then Congress establish rules such that those unprecedented execution of power could be limited for future?
Yeah, give me an example of what you're thinking about.
There's so much.
I know. I know.
I'm
Well,
trying to figure how, because you said like if you allow the president to execute a power that's not enumerated,
good.
and you can't retrieve it, you can't take it back. So you're giving it, and precedent allows then the next president then to say, well, it was done, the last time.
Yeah.
Where's the check? Like, so can't there be a stop?
So next class, whenever the hell that is, we do a case called Morrison versus Olson, which involves a special counsel, independent counsel statute. The independent counsel statute was an attempt to put a check on the president's power to investigate the executive branch. That might answer some of your questions. We'll also do a case called Noel Canning, which involves a recess power, which addresses the adverse possession theory. So you've done the adverse possession in property?
Property too.
Okay, you've talked about it. Very good. So can you hold on to your question until our next class, like in a month, whenever it is? But I don't want you to miss it. So when you get to next class, I want you to ask me the same question again. Can you do that for me? You can remember? And if someone else, you can remind her, okay? But just, it's a good question, but it's addressed more clearly, I think, in the next class than this one. I don't want to take on. Okay. So any other questions on Merriman? Okay, the next reading I gave you wasn't a case. Like, why the hell is he giving this, right? And again, what does the Emancipation Proclamation have to do with Youngstown, right? Why is this one after the other? So the short answer is, right? The short answer is the Emancipation Proclamation was an exercise of presidential power that was completely unenumerated. By what authority can President Lincoln free slaves? Oh, 1 second. Okay. Oh, you're next. But I'll get you in a minute. I'm not done yet, right? But what authority can he do this? Now, first off, you were probably all taught in high school, and I was, that Lincoln freed the slaves. That's not exactly accurate. It's not exactly accurate. Okay, so first off, what emancipated the slaves was the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1865. That abolished slavery everywhere. But Lincoln did something far short of that with the Emancipation Proclamation. Here's a map. Okay? So first off, the Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in territory that was controlled by Confederate forces. Yeah, the rebel territory. But not all of them. It's actually a little bit odd. I've looked into this. For whatever reason, certain parishes in Louisiana, New Orleans, for example, was actually loyal to the Union. I think it had to do with the trade and the Mississippi, and they actually still controlled. So it wasn't all the Confederate territories, but it was the territories in rebellion. Okay? Union states with slavery, Maryland, for example, Kentucky, Tennessee, right? Union states, the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply. It only applied to rebel states that were in open rebellion. So first off, Sam, let me ask you this question. It might not be the one you want to answer, but I'll give you this question anyway. Sam, why did Lincoln not go ahead and emancipate the slaves nationwide, including in Maryland and other Union states?
They already believed that.
I'm sorry?
Didn't they already were practicing that?
No, slavery was active in Maryland throughout the Civil War. It was a very prominent slave state. In fact, when Union generals marched in Maryland, they would spit on them. Right? It was a very divided state. So Sam, my question, you aren't on deck, but Sam, my question is, why did Lincoln not extend the Emancipation Proclamation nationwide, coast to coast, in the blue states on the map? Right, the red states were the slave states, and the blue ones were the Union states with still slavery. Do you know the answer?
Maybe he didn't want to push those states to join the Confederation.
Well, that's true. There was a fear of alienating the states, but I think there's a constitutional reason. Yaren, you want to take a?
He didn't have the power to. So he,
What do you mean he didn't have the power to?
So the way that he was able to write the Emancipation Proclamation and to he would only do it because they were good on they were the rebellion states. So it was only allowed to do that for the states that were rebelling.
She's right. She's correct. Now, Yaren, let me give you a follow-up question. And Marcus on deck is eagerly trying to jump in, right? Yeah, so Yaren, I'll give you a follow-up question, right? Where are the president's war powers? Congress never declared war. I told you that, guys, an hour ago, right? What are these powers that you're referring to? Congress never declared war on the Civil War. Never did it, not once.
I think they just did it as like, it was just a strategic way to do it, to be honest.
Yeah, Marcus, you want to add something to this? Okay, what's in Article 2, Section 2?
President should be Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Navy, United States, and of the militia of several states.
Is that it? That means he can free the slaves? I mean, does that give him that power?
When there's a war going on, yes.
Is there a war going on, my friend?
Or is there a rebellion going on? Right? Or a war.
Okay, Carrie?
Here, I mean,
Yeah.
but it's still not a war.
It's
So
not a war. So what the heck is it?
A rebellion.
It's not just. It's just what?
A rebellion.
It's just smart. Okay, you think it was smart?
I thought it was genius.
Okay, good. Tell me why you think it was genius.
He had this problem where he didn't have to
Right. Right.
Constitutional back
Oh.
up to what he was doing.
Why?
He called them rebellious, and people was able to emancipate them.
Okay, Yaren, that's a very good point. Let me ask you one more question because you volunteered. Why did Lincoln need constitutional authority? Why couldn't he just say, I am freeing the slaves because it's the right thing to do. It's a moral thing to do. Slavery is immoral. We were wrong to have this in the first place. Why did he need a constitutional authority? Why couldn't he just say and say, I'm the president, damn it, free the slaves?
Because all our power comes from the Constitution.
So even if now you said it was a creative, is that the word you used? Creative? Genius, I'm sorry. I say creative, right? Now the actual argument is very of how Lincoln had the power to emancipate the slaves. What was the actual constitutional argument that Yaren alluded to a minute ago?
By freeing the slaves, they were able to head north, and they would be accepted.
But, okay, so there's a couple pieces here I want to disentangle, right? So first off, the emancipation allowed slaves to enter Union territory and join the military. And if they join the military, they can then become citizens of the United States. Right? That's actually the easier part. Now, you haven't said Dred Scott. I know Kenesha read it, and we talked about it the other day. But Dred Scott held very clearly. I'm sorry?
Black people weren't citizens.
Could never be citizens. Yes, thank you, Markia. Right? Dred Scott held without any doubt that people of African descent, slave or free, doesn't matter, could never be citizens of the United States. Lincoln said, whatever. Right? Again, so this is Lincoln and Tawney, same deal. Right? Was Lincoln a party to Dred Scott? No, he was not. The same argument. Dred Scott was a case between Dred Scott and Sanford, not Lincoln. And Lincoln said, President wasn't part of that case, I'm not bound by it. So Dred Scott said that people of African descent, slave or free, could never become citizens of the United States. So Lincoln basically ignored that and said, screw that. If you come to Union territory, you join the military, you get U.S. citizenship, and with that you get all the rights that come with citizenship. But that was the easier part, right? What about the slaves who didn't join the military? Under what ground were they emancipated?
Well, it's kind of ironic because he actually uses the idea that they're property, and therefore he can seize property of rebellions, and so he used that actually against the South.
Yaren, you're shaking your head on that one.
Oh, I just thought this whole thing was amazing. So
So you think it's good? Okay, so Did anyone see the movie Gone with the Wind? And there's a scene, right, where there's like a barn full of like goods and stuff, and basically the army just seizes it, takes over it. Remember that scene from the movie? Lincoln did that to slaves. And I don't want to say this too callously, but Lincoln basically said, I will treat rebel property, chattel, slaves, as a property of the Union Army, and I'm going to seize it. And once the property is owned by the U.S. government, he can then emancipate, liberate, free. Everyone just get the logistics, right? Right? The same way if a Union Army came across a factory of munitions, of cannons, they say, you know what? We are seizing this for U.S. government property, and we're going to just put it in our army. They said, okay, we're finding slaves. We're going to emancipate them immediately. Now, Yaren loves this. I mean, she's just jumping around. This is just great. It's a bit unsettling, right? I have to, every time I teach her, they just have to just take a step back and say, this is a good outcome. Legally, though, it just has the weirdest feeling to it. Because, first off, Marcus made the point, there's no express power to do this, right? There just isn't. There's the commander-in-chief power, but there's no declared war. Second, there is a power to seize property in the Fifth Amendment, but that power belongs to Congress. And that power was never exercised by the executive, it was exercised by Congress. And the third part is perhaps the most unsettling aspect. If Congress takes private property, they have to provide just compensation. Did Lincoln provide any compensation? And I know this is a grotesque to even say, but did Lincoln provide compensation to the Southerners whose slaves were emancipated? And the answer is absolutely not. Now, this was not a trivial concern. There was a serious fear that after the Revolution, that after the Civil War, that the former Confederate slave owners would bring claims in court for compensation. There was a legitimate fear, and I ran the numbers once. I don't have them in front of me, but it was a lot of money, right? There were prices for a head. It's grotesque, but there were prices, and they could actually claim this. So I mentioned this briefly. I already cited Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Go to Section 4 of the 14th Amendment. This is the part no one ever reads. But this addresses the fear that Tricia raised a minute ago. It says, neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States, or any claim for the loss of emancipation of any slave. What's that saying? It's basically covering their asses, right? It's basically conceding that Lincoln didn't have the authority to do what he did, and that to the extent the government seized property, they don't have to pay for it, right? Because again, there were, I think I looked into this once, there were actually court cases pending at the time of the 14th Amendment where people were trying to seek compensation for the emancipation, right? But again, what's the connection? Who has the power to suspend the writ? Congress. Lincoln did it anyway. Who has the power to seize property? Congress, but Lincoln did it anyway and didn't pay for it. So you have President Lincoln, who never had a declared war, prosecuting this conflict based entirely on these broad, unenumerated war powers in the absence of a war. Lincoln did things that were simply unfathomable because he believed, and 1 second, Yarn, I'll get you. He believed that if the Union falls, the Constitution has no merit, right? That the Union doesn't stand, then who cares? That argument might have worked out okay for Honest Abe, but that same argument in the hands of someone else would be a very different story. Yeah, Yarn.
I guess that was my question. Because here, I thought it was genius the way he did this and was able to, I mean, it was obviously the right thing to do, so but going back to what they said before on what he did the president of how you relay it back in.
Yep.
So whether as here it was used for the good, does that mean that still now, or maybe have we not gotten there, that the president's powers get a little bit smaller? Because here I thought it was necessary, but I don't know if that will always be the case.
Yeah. No. Marcus, you want to add something?
I don't think they necessarily gave him the power don't think he was able to use the verbiage to justify what he was doing.
So what does it say, Marcus, when the president can use verbiage or creative arguments that aren't very good, right, to justify absorption of power, right? Again, and we can all say, yes, Lincoln did good things, right? He also suspended the writ of habeas corpus. That's not a trivial matter, right? That means the Union General could just lock people up without any notice whatsoever. I mean, that's a pretty big deal that had never been done before. Lincoln also suspended, there were telegraphs back then. He basically, before there was a Fourth Amendment thing, they were searching telegrams, right? They were searching mails, right? He was censoring the mails to see if people were shipping, material that's harmful to the government, right? Lincoln did a lot of things that were very questionable. Because, what was that? They were monitoring telegrams and telegraph wires. Yeah, Markia.
This goes back to Bush after 9/11, when
Yeah.
9/11 to basically tap everyone's phones and listen.
Well, yeah, with some variations, but the general idea is this: when you have a time of war, right? We'll do Korematsu, I think, next week after my little mini constitutional vacation, but there's an expression we'll cover, in times of war, the laws fall silent. We'll do this one over and over again. And it's very easy to justify the executive, because the executive's unitary. He moves quick, he moves effectively, he moves efficient. Suspend habeas, done, right? Seize the steel mill, can be done right away. Emancipate slaves, done right away, right? There's no voting, there's no Congress, it just happens, right? And it's great when you like when the president does it, and then when it's not so great when he does something you dislike. But whenever you give the president authority and it's not checked, it's not clawed back in, that's aggrandized. That's the gloss, which Justice Frankfurter discusses, and it's hard to bring it back in. It's the adverse possession theory of constitutional governance. Okay? So, the 13th Amendment had genius, creative, amazing, whatever word you want to use, legal arguments, but they're pretty weak, right? I mean, this was not a lock-solid case. And in fact, objections to it from one Justice Curtis. And Justice Curtis is most famous for having dissented in Dred Scott. Right? Again, so the guy who dissented in Dred Scott thought that this was unconstitutional, which tells you how controversial this was. One more thing. Justice Curtis was so sick with Roger Taney, he resigned from the court. He resigned from the Supreme Court after Dred Scott. He said, I can't deal with this crap anymore. Right? He just ghosted Taney. Right? He's gone. And then one more. Curtis went to private practice, and he actually defended Andrew Johnson during his impeachment trial. So this guy had a fascinating career, right? He defended the president during his impeachment trial following the Civil War. One last point on Lincoln. There was a really good book published a couple years ago called The Assassination of Abraham Lincoln. No, I'm sorry. Called The Impeachment Trial of Abraham Lincoln. And it's historical fiction. And the premise was this. Lincoln survived the assassination attempt. The premise is Lincoln survived John Wilkes Booth's bullet. But after he survived, he became very unpopular. And he was impeached. Why? Get rid of habeas corpus. That Congress came after him and said that you violated the Constitution by suspending the writ. And also because you inspected the amazing, creative, constitutional arguments. Congress tried to impeach him for it. I can't remember how it ended. It was a really good book, but I don't remember the ending. I didn't like the ending, but the book itself was good. Mia?
So in the book, did Congress retroactively authorize his suspension of habeas corpus?
They had, but they said the initial decision was not valid, which I think is probably correct. I mean, Congress can do it, right? But I think they focused a lot on the suspension of the mails and the telegram wires. They were really big on that. He had no power to do that without any warrants issued. And he intercepted the mails. But, again, Lincoln, depends who you ask, is a savior or tyrant, right? But his actions, morally just but constitutionally suspect. Whatever he was worth. Important president, without question. I mean, if we didn't have Lincoln, I don't know what our country would look like if it even exists.
I wouldn't be here.
I don't think you would be. Right? Yeah, but important time in American history. We'll come back to this period after the, I think it's either right before the midterm or right after the midterm. We'll do the 13th and 14th Amendment. We'll revisit the Civil War and Reconstruction in a lot more depth, but you get a little flavor for it in class today. Very important period. 1860s, a lot of stuff was happening. Totally transformed the country. Okay, questions on Merryman or on the Emancipation Proclamation? Anything in your minds? Move on to Youngstown? Yeah? All right, Mark here? That's in your book. Yeah, it's in the little box in your book. You don't have to Google. I give it to you. One more. Merryman named his son Roger Brooke Tawney. Well, well, Maryland again was a slave state, but it was pro-Confederacy. So there were plenty of Confederate lawyers who were helping out Merryman in the Maryland court.
But like Mississippi didn't have a senator in D.C.
No. The southern states were denied representation. And they didn't get representation until after Reconstruction, until the 1870s. One more fun fact. I think one of Mississippi's first senators was actually African American. Drawing a blank on his name. One of the first senators Mississippi sent to Washington after the war was an African American gentleman. What was his name? Is it Hiram Revels? God, I'm going to Google it now. Was that his name? Oh, got it. Yeah, Hiram Revels. Too much, but it was a little ambiguous, right? Where they had people, a little bit hodgepodge. It wasn't like a secession blueprint of how to do it. So some left, some didn't. It was very, well, awkward, yeah. But the entire nature, just one other point, the entire idea that Congress was passing bills when half the Congress was disqualified is very suspect. And the amendments that were ratified, 13th and 14th, were ratified under somewhat dubious circumstances because the states are basically twisting their arms, right? They had to do it.
The amendment hadn't even been passed yet, so were they disqualified yet?
They weren't allowed back into Congress till Congress said so. So there was a lot of things. Lincoln wasn't the only person pushing boundaries. The Republicans in Congress, the radical Republicans, they're called radical for a reason. They did a lot of things that were dubious things. They said, okay, you want to be readmitted to Congress, go enact the 14th Amendment. Right? Is that a valid enactment? And to this day, people think that these are not valid constitutional provisions.
Just a quick question.
Yes, ma'am.
Curtis dissent. I just wanted to make sure I got it right. So he.
Well, it wasn't dissent. It was opinion.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Right.
He basically just said that Lincoln could not have a in the military, not civilians.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. I mean, if they're in the military, it's a different story. But the initial emancipation is a different deal, right? To people who are just there and not leaving. Okay. Okay. Any other questions on Merryman or emancipation? Did you go to Harvard? Okay, probably a student of Justice Story, in fact. Justice Story was one of the first major professors at Harvard Law School. Thank you. I did not know that. Another one, Justice Jackson, who wrote Youngstown, didn't graduate from law school. He went to Albany for 2 years, never graduated. Justice Robert Jackson. You're getting jealous, I know. Look, if you can write like Jackson, I'll let you pass the bar. Right? If you can do what Jackson does, I will give you your diploma right now. I wish I could write like Jackson. All right. What else? Who am I up to? I forgot where I am. Adrian, are you next? You give me thumbs up. Are you... No, I did Trisha. I think you're next. All right, Adrian. You want She versus Sawyer.
So, that was a dispute, a labor dispute in the American steel with, workers.
Why were we fighting with Korea? It's still unclear. It was basically a proxy war of the Cold War, right? That we allied with the southern part of Korea, and the Soviet Union allied with the northern part of Korea. And then after this long, intractable conflict that didn't really go anywhere, there was neither a victory nor a defeat, the country basically split in half, right? That's why we have a North Korea and a South Korea today. And there's a DMZ, the demilitarized zone, this line that goes down the middle of the country. To this day, South Korea is a democratic nation, and North Korea is a communist dictatorship, right? Fun fact, this is actually a fun fact, because we never actually declared an end to the conflict in Korea, it's still going, and technically, the president used force without any new authorization. What? We never declared any armistice or cessation of hostilities in Korea. So to the extent that President Truman had authority to prosecute that war, same authority exists today. Oh, who knows? Fun fact. Fun fact. Fun fact. But anyway, during this war, there was a need to have a steady flow of steel for tanks and planes, everything else. Okay, Adrian, go on. I didn't mean to interrupt you. So okay, with that being said, what happened?
So, the owners
Okay. Nope. Okay, now just one more, Adrian, I'll let you go. To seize the steel mills. What does that actually mean?
That he took them over. So
Did the president do it by himself?
no, he granted the Commerce.
Very good.
Yeah, Secretary, he granted him the power to oversee it, and he said he took some owners and then put them over those mills, and they were instructed to keep functioning.
Very good. Very good. Very good. Thank you, Adrian. So the case is not Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Truman. It's Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer. And who was Sawyer? Sawyer was the Secretary of Commerce. President Truman issued executive order. By the way, Samantha, what's an executive order? We're talking about always executive order, sign this, sign that. What the heck's an executive order? Oh, good. Decree, okay. Very good. And what authority? By what authority can the president issue an executive order or a decree? I like that also. by which the president has to exercise his power. The Constitution say how the president does his job. This is a good point, right? Oh, tweet this. But it doesn't matter how the president does his job. And just it's often called and when you listen to Judge Kavanaugh, Judge Kavanaugh's hearing last week, he cited Youngstown over and over and over. Roberts cited Youngstown, Katie cited Youngstown, Sotomayor cited Youngstown, Gorsuch cited Youngstown. They all cite that, right? Why all the judges why do all the people in the Supreme Court cite Youngstown over and over? Ah, exactly. And I think Kavanaugh said it perhaps most clearly. Youngstown represents an element of judicial independence, where you had judges tell this president seems to agree on anything, and you got a single dissent. When the justices move quickly, they often don't have unanimity, and this is the case with that situation. But, well, actually, like Chisholm, right? Seriatim, right? Reminds me of the good old days. I actually like this better personally, because each justice wrote something completely different, and it gave you a very different way of looking at it. And I have my favorites, and I like more or less one of the other. So, let's start one at a time. Oh, by the way, one more point. What would have happened if, when the federal government took ownership of the steel mill and the workers tried to go on strike? What would have happened? What would have happened if the federal government took over the mills and the steel workers went on strike? And what does the government do to rebels? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. They'd be arrested. Be arrested. So this is not a joke, right? This is not just Truman saying, okay, we'll just take ownership. They were putting a U.S. government, they're putting a business under U.S. government surveillance that if they didn't obey the orders, if you go to work now, they'd be arrested. If the plant manager said, we're walking off the job, you're arrested. If the mill workers, you're arrested. It's a big deal. Isn't it? Can the government make you work? Throw you in jail if you decide not to go to work? So I mean, again, this was a very harsh penalty, right? If Congress had done it, it might be a different story because Congress provided compensation, but they weren't going to arrest you. But the president was, you go to work, you get arrested. Military police taking over the facility. It seems an Atlas shrugged, right? All right, so Tim, walk through each of the opinions one at a time. Let's start with Justice Hugo Black. Hugo Black was a FDR nominee. His perhaps most famous or infamous claim to fame is he was a Klansman. Yeah, he was a member. And it was like one of the worst kept secrets in Washington. And it only came to light after he was confirmed, right? There was a story written like after his hearing. And in fact, his confirmation hearing was held in secret, right? It was basically a private hearing because they didn't want it to leak out. And this is a great story. On the first day that he assumed the bench, right? The clerk of the court goes, oyez, oyez, oyez. They start the session. And then some lawyer stands up and says, Your Honor, I object. Wait, you're in the Supreme Court. A lawyer actually objected as a member of the bar to Hugo Black be on the Supreme Court. And the Chief Justice basically said, you're out of line, go sit down. And that was the end of it. It turned out that Black actually made good. He actually became a huge advocate for civil rights. He became a free speech absolutist. He believed that no law on free speech was acceptable. No law means no law. And he became quite liberal over his career.
So he quit KKK?
He quit the KKK. Oh, he resigned, yeah. He claimed that, he said that when you're in Alabama politics, you had to join. I'll leave that aside. But he actually never forgot that. I think he became quite liberal and probably one of those liberal members of the court of the next 30 years. But it's history. So, Tim, walk me through Justice Black's analysis.
Okay, so he starts off with his statement of the president's power, if any, to issue the order must stem from either an act of Congress or from the Constitution itself.
Good.
And then he goes on to say, he says, there was no statute for him to rely on. As a matter of fact, it notes in the facts that the president had notified Congress twice of his actions.
Good.
And they never did anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
And he points it out by saying Congress has refused to adopt that method to settle labor disputes.
Good.
He goes on that the government is pointing out that this presidential power can be implied from aggregating his powers under, as you have up there, Article 2, the vesting clause, and then the faithfully executed. In order to put those together, and he just completely and totally does not buy that.
Okay.
He says the president's power to see the laws are faithfully executed refutes the idea that he's a lawmaker, and by taking these actions, he's actually making law.
Very good.
He points out the fact that the Constitution says all legislative powers are vested in the Congress. And so what the president has done here is to try to be a lawmaker, which he's not vested to do. Let's see.
I think you've given it's good enough. That's good. Stop right there. That's like an answer for 4 people, right? So Justice Black was a textualist, right? He was something of an originalist before originalism was a thing. So he, for example, he would see the First Amendment, and it says, Congress should make no law abridging the freedom of speech. And he said, no law means no law. He thought that everything was unconstitutional, any speech restriction. So there were a lot of cases in the 50s and 60s. This goes way back. The Supreme Court actually had a theater where they would screen pornos. They would watch pornographic films to determine if it was obscene. They would sit there and they'd watch these movies together, right? What?
Something like actually pornographic or something like shows a leg?
I mean, porno for the 60s. I don't know, right? You can use your... And Jesse, this is why you shouldn't bring your daughter to class. But Justice Black refused to go to movie night. Okay? Because he said all these movies are protected by the Constitution. Didn't matter how grotesque it was, how bad it was, right? So, yeah. And by the way, Justice Harlan was basically blind at that point, but he would still go. I don't know where the theater is. I think I figured out where it was. There's a little room in the basement where I think it probably was, but I don't know for sure. But Justice Black was a textualist. And he makes a textual argument. He makes textual arguments. He says, look, the president can only have powers that are delegated by the Constitution or delegated by statute. The Constitution says nothing about giving the president the power to seize property, and there's no statute. In fact, Congress had considered such a statute. This is an important point, right? Congress considered giving the president the power to take over a company, a steel mill, in times of a labor strike. They considered it, but they rejected it, which suggests that Congress doesn't want the president to have this power. He also looks at the Take Care Clause, which I won't have time to talk about, but I'll mention it briefly. It says the president shall take care the laws are faithfully executed. And the fact that it talks about executing the laws suggests the president can't enact the laws. He is not a law maker. Right? So the Black opinion is the majority. And I think it's the most straightforward of the five, which is probably why it's the majority. It's a very structural argument, right? That if a power is not delegated by statute or the Constitution, the president lacks that power. But, well,
So earlier you had mentioned that the president could not give his power, like for example, to you. So, but the Congress can do the same. I mean,
well, think about it, Noel. Whenever the Congress passes a statute telling the president he can do something, what are they doing?
well, they're essentially.
They're giving him power. That's where the president gets authority from. Congress enacts statutes, right? Now, we did a case with Schechter-Poultry, you recall, where Congress gave the president the power to define crimes. You know what the court did there? What's the doctrine called? What's that doctrine called we mentioned? Anyone? The doctrine we talked about in Schechter-Poultry, where Congress gave the president the power to define crimes. Anyone? That's it. Yes, sir, Justin. Gold star. The non-delegation doctrine. What is that?
Congress cannot delegate legislative powers to agencies or to president without giving guidance.
Yeah. In that case, Congress gave the president a blank check to pass criminal laws. And that was a no-go. But Congress can give the president the power to seize a mill. They say, we authorize a seizure. President, go send your military officers to take care of it. That's not a problem. But Congress didn't give the president the power to seize the mills. He did not give that power. And therefore, Justice Black says Congress lacks that power. I'm sorry, the president. Any questions on the Black opinion? Okay, so the first opinion was by Justice Hugo Black. The first concurring opinion was by Justice Felix Frankfurter. Felix Frankfurter is the reason why you should never put a professor on the Supreme Court. Everyone hated him. He was a law professor at Harvard. He was very arrogant. It's a type. He would used to give these lectures in the Supreme Court conference room for 40 minutes at a time because Harvard classes were 40 minutes long. He would just go out and lecture. And he was one of the FDR appointees, and they all hated each other. But I think Frankfurter gave a couple of important points about this authority. So, Gerald, does Frankfurter think the president's powers are limited to those written in the text of the Constitution or in statutes?
No.
Okay, what does Justice Frankfurter think that we can also look to beyond the text of the Constitution and the statutes of Congress?
Past president action.
Yeah, walk me through that, please.
Dangers of like how it doesn't come in a day, it takes like a while for this power to come into
fruition. It's not like
Hmm?
from one president.
Presidents have done something, and Congress never questioned it. Why should that matter, right? Why should lots of lawbreakers be able to set a new precedent, right? Why should this be like Lincoln or adverse possession, right? Why should it operate like that? Why should a court respect the fact that lots of presidents broke the law and Congress didn't seem to object? But why should the Constitution change based on what presidents have done in the past? What's this gloss he talks about?
Sort of to, I guess, as a way, maybe as another way to define the ambiguous powers of a president. So if you add this test essentially, you now have a better way to define what the.
So Dan, let me ask this question. Does Frankfurter know for sure what the scope of executive powers are? Black seems pretty confident he knows, right? But Frankfurter's not sure. Dana, why does Frankfurter look then to executive practice to try and define these authorities?
Well, I think it was going back. If there was never an issue, if the past presidents have done this and nothing was brought up about it was wrong,
Good.
and then you can do that.
Yeah, because look, Congress wants to guard its own powers, right? Congress wants to guard its own powers. And if Congress doesn't object when the president does something, that's pretty good evidence that Congress had no objection. And if Congress had no objection, then why should the courts object? In other words, if two branches of government agree, who is the judge to say that they're both wrong? Right? If the president takes an oath to the Constitution, and members of Congress take an oath to the Constitution, and there's an unbroken chain where every president seems to do something over and over again, and every Congress seems to give its blessing, that's okay. Again, this is not a one-time episode where Lincoln did something crazy and it's like, okay, that's okay. It's an unbroken, systematic chain which was never questioned. So it's actually a fairly high threshold, right? Frankfurter doesn't make this easy. It's got to be a lot of people doing the same thing. And we have this phrase, a gloss on the Constitution. It's, one second, Mark, here. Basically, what? One second. So it's a gloss, right? Basically adds a new layer to the Constitution itself. Yes, Markia, go ahead.
I was trying to figure out where this quote is that Gerald was reading.
Gerald, was it not in the book?
Yeah, page 550.
550.
At the end of the second paragraph.
Hope it's in there. Yes, ma'am. All right, so that's Frankfurter, right? He would look to executive branch experience. Frankfurter would look to executive branch experience to define what the executive powers are. All right. Justice Douglas makes what I think is a fairly compelling argument, and it's short and sweet. Right? We look at the takings clause. It says you can take private property, you have to provide compensation. The president can't spend a nickel, a penny, without Congress. Unless Congress appropriates funding, the president can't spend it. Therefore, the power has to belong to the Congress. This is very much like Tawney, right? It's a structural argument that's similar to Tawney and Merriman. I think he's probably right on this much. Okay? And although Justice Douglas, also a law professor, was appointed to the court and was very young. He was like 37 or 38, very young guy. He served way too long, though. He actually had seizures later in life and became basically incapacitated, but he refused to resign. And it got to the point where his colleagues would not let him cast a tie-breaking vote. That if there was any case where he was the fifth vote, they would just re-argue the case. They basically just like shoot him away. and eventually he stepped down. But he served for way too long. Way too long. Okay. Let's go on to the next opinion. The most famous opinion in Youngstown is not from the majority Justice Black, it's not from Frankfurter, it's not from Douglas. It comes from Robert Jackson. Now, Robert Jackson's a remarkable guy. He, again, never graduated law school. He served in the Roosevelt administration as Solicitor General, as Attorney General, and then he got appointed to the Supreme Court. And while he was on the court, he was sent to Nuremberg. These were the war tribunals for the for the perpetrators of the Holocaust. And he actually tried the Nazis. So Jackson had a very strong sense of what happens when you have a dangerous executive. He understood that perhaps better than anyone else in the court. He saw fascism firsthand. He got that. But Jackson also wasn't a textualist like Black. He wasn't a structuralist like Douglas was. And I don't think he put that much weight in experience as did Frankfurter. Because in fact, when Jackson was in the Roosevelt administration, he basically approved seizing private property unilaterally, right? He kind of did what Truman did, and I think he regretted it later in life. So the Jackson opinion is best remembered for this framework, right? These three categories. Now, law students love applying this framework in all the wrong places. So listen to me very carefully. Listen to me very carefully. If the question is, does Congress have the power to do something, you do not apply Jackson. You don't apply. It's irrelevant. I can't tell you how many exams do this. It drives me nuts. The only time you're going to apply Jackson is asking, does the executive, does the president have the power to take some action? You do not apply this in a congressional case. You only apply it for a presidential case. Understand? Yeah. Yes, I'll read it. The only time you're applying the Jackson framework is if the question asks, does the executive, does the president have a power to take some action? Good? So Jackson is very functional, right? Frankfurter requires a long, systematic pattern to determine if it's appropriate. Jackson's a little bit easier to qualify, right? He says, let's look at this action, and let's see what's the relationship between Congress and the president, right? And there are three tiers, or zones. You see tiers, zones, you call them different things, right? Like the tiers of a cake. So the first tier, the president's authority, is at its maximum. Okay? And I'll lecture here because it's a little bit tricky. Why is the president's authority at its maximum? Because he's acting with all of possible powers that exist. He's acting with the powers from the Constitution plus the powers from statutes, right? He has all of his own powers in Article 2 plus the powers given to him by statutes. He has the maximum authority. Okay? What's the consequence of the president acting pursuant to a statute? The action has the strongest presumption of constitutionality. Right? When the statute says, Mr. President, you take these steel mills, and the president says, I have the power to take the steel mill on my own authority, it has the strongest presumption of constitutionality. Courts should be very skeptical of striking things down. Now, can the court strike down something in the first tier? Absolutely. It happens all the time. All the time, Congress enacts statutes giving the president some power, and the court still strikes it down. But it has a presumption that the law is constitutional. Okay? Is everyone with me? I'm going to skip ahead to number 3. I'll come back to 2 in a minute. The third power, so the third category, is the president's authority is at its lowest ebb. What the hell does that mean? If you ever think of a tide, right, where the tide comes in and the tide comes out by a shore, when the tide's at its lowest ebb, the water's all the way out. It's very shallow, right? There's not a lot of water. When is the president acting in his lowest ebb? He can rely only on his constitutional authority. He can rely only on the constitutional authority. He has no statutory authority. That was the case in Youngstown, right? Congress did not give him the power to seize the mills. He did it anyway, and he asserted he had the constitutional authority to take that action. Everyone with me? Okay. Now, if the first tier, right? Am I blocking? I'm sorry. It's a terribly placed projector. They put it in the worst possible spot. I'll stand aside, right? No statutory authority. Okay? Now, if in the first tier there's a presumption of constitutionality, in the third tier it's the exact opposite. There's a presumption the statute is not constitutional, right? You presume the president's acting unlawfully because he doesn't have any statutory authority. And my colleague Randy Barnett refers to this as a presumption of liberty. That is, the individual, the steel mill owner, for example, prevails, right? You presume that when the president acts only based on whatever authority he says he has, he's acting unlawfully, unless he has very good evidence to the contrary. In this case, there's none. Right? So the first tier and the third tier are somewhat parallel. But then we come to number 2. And this is the one that gives students always the most difficulty, which is the so-called zone of twilight. Do you ever see that old show, The Twilight Zone? Right? Right? What is twilight? It's that time of day where it's not quite day, it's not quite night, the sky's kind of purplish. You know what I'm talking about, right? There's that moment where it's not really clear what's going on. Here, it's not clear whether Congress gave him that authority. And it's also not very clear whether the president has his own inherent constitutional authority. When I say inherent, I mean Article 2, right? It's not clear as inherent constitutional authority. What happens here? Shrug emoticon. I don't know. Jackson doesn't really say. It says depends on the imperatives of events. No abstract theory of law decides it. So really, it's this fancy framework that's saying, did Congress give the president the power? If they gave it to him, the president wins. If they didn't give him the power, he probably loses. Now, can you survive zone 3? You can, right? Can law be upheld in the third zone? Yeah, it can. It can, right? If the president has that power, then he doesn't need Congress, can act by himself. So this framework, which law students love, doesn't really get you much. Judges love quoting Jackson, but they actually do Felix, right? They love quoting Jackson, but when a push comes to shove, they look to Frankfurter and executive branch experience. That's where they usually go to. And you'll see this in other cases this semester. So the upshot is, Jackson finds that he's in the third tier here, that Congress did not give the power to seize the mills, and therefore it's unconstitutional. It does not survive this presumption of liberty because the president doesn't have the authority to do this unilaterally. Let me ask Josh, what's the difference between Jackson and Frankfurter and Black and Douglas? Not much. They'll wind up in the exact same place, but for very different reasons, right? There's not a world of difference. The only difference is Black will be limiting just to the text. Frankfurter will look to a long train of history and experience, and Jackson will say, well, what's going on here? Right? Jackson's framework is not very helpful, but the judges love citing it. I used to be a much bigger Jackson fan, but I've sort of fallen to the Frankfurter camp over the last couple of years. I don't know why. But I've fallen out of my Jackson fad. Okay, so any questions on Jackson?
So in
Yes.
your interpretation of this 3-part test, the difference between number 2 and number 3 is that number 2 has an overlap with, that's the concurrent authority.
Yeah. Zone, Congress could have given power, but they didn't. They withheld it. So if Zone 1 is Congress plus the president, then Zone 3 is the president minus Congress.
Yeah. Well, like where their powers are concurrent, I could see where it's like, okay, number 2, like, let's kind of, you know, do this, and then number 3 would be like, he can do. In some cases, it might be like, you can't do it all because minus Congress makes. But like it could also be where it's like he could do this, but this chunk goes back to Congress.
Yeah, yeah. These
Don't make it a mandatory.
no, and this, I used to spend a lot more time these sort of falling out of love with them because they don't really help students and they don't add applies like wait a minute, he has a power, he doesn't, right? The other thing is, even if you remember, he could have ignored it, but didn't. Then what happened? The workers went on strike, as promised. They struck for 50 days, and it didn't really make much of a difference for the war. So once again, the president's claim of necessity was probably embellished just a tad. Truman apparently was irate at the decision. Justice Black invited Truman over, and Truman says, Hugo, I don't care much for your law, but by golly, this bourbon is good. And I like that little anecdote to bookend the case, because even though you have this massive clash between the executive and the judiciary, for whatever reason, the executive said, okay, I listen. Not, we're fighting a war too damn bad. Okay. Any questions in Youngstown? Yes, Markia?
So essentially the dissent is saying that the president has broad authority as long as it doesn't violate the Constitution.
The dissent saying that the president will be controlled by the differential standard. Anything else? All right, enjoy your break. I will see you the following week.